We are continuing our study in the book of 2 Corinthians today. We're going to work through the second half of chapter 11. In this section of scripture, Paul is responding to the false apostles who have come to Corinth and are bothering the church there. These apostles claim some fake authority, and the people in Corinth, the church at Corinth, doesn't have the discernment to tell that they are not real apostles. They were swallowing this story that they're selling hook, line, and sinker. And this is affecting the fellowship of the church, and it's affecting the ministry that Paul has. And so Paul is very stern in dealing with these false apostles in this last section of the book here as we work through this. Now, today, in this particular few verses, Paul is going to do some boasting about his supposed accomplishments. And as we work through these boastings, think about the things that we would boast about. What would we be inclined to boast about if we're going to boast? We would be inclined to maybe boast about our athletic prowess. I remember talking to someone one time. This was a lady in an office. I was called on to work on the computers there, and she was talking about her grandson. And her grandson, who I think was about 14 years old, somewhere in there, could throw a perfect spiral with the football. And that's all she could talk about. She was so proud of her grandson throwing this perfect football spiral. This is the thing she was boasting about. Or someone might boast about the cars that they had when they were a teenager, how fast these cars were, how pretty they were, whatever aspect of these cars were. So what other things you could boast about? But how often do you hear people boasting about being in prison? You don't hear that. You don't hear people boasting about these things, and we're going to see in an astonishing way. This is what Paul is boasting about as he goes in his boasting. Let's start here. Paul suffering as an apostle, 2 Corinthians 11:16. I say again, let no man think me foolish, but if otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. So Paul is considering this boasting. We're going to see this here a couple of times. Paul considers this kind of boasting very foolish, because this type of boasting does not glorify God. And Paul says this is foolish talk, but yet he needs to do this to get the attention of the Corinthian church. He's trying to get their attention. This is an attention getter. Verse 17. That which I speak it not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in this confidence of boasting. So Paul, again, this is not helping the person to get to salvation by the things Paul's going to say here. Paul is just trying to get their attention and point out the error of these false apostles. Proverbs 26:25 says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. And so that's what Paul is doing here. He's answering these fools according to their folly. Verse 18. Seeing that many boast after the flesh, I will boast also. So if Paul would just stand by and be quiet, the boasters would take advantage of the situation, and it would be detrimental to the health of the church. And so Paul is going to step forward here and reply to these boasters. And now Paul addresses here, for you put up with fools gladly, seeing that you yourselves are so wise. So this is a little bit of sarcasm here, that Paul is telling the Corinthian church that they're so wise. They suffer these fools. You are so wise. And so, obviously, this is meant to get their attention. This sarcastic words here, he's helping them to see things for what they really are. And now comes the punchline in verse 20, according to and I'm going to read from the ISV here. You tolerate anyone who makes you his slaves, who devours what you have, who takes what is yours, who orders you around, or slaps your face. Paul's painting a picture here of an abusive relationship. These false apostles were only in it for themselves. They were emotionally manipulating the people of the church to get their own way. And how were they doing this? By making the church members feel inferior to them. By ordering them around. By taking their things, whatever goods and monies they had, they were taking that money. They were devouring that. They were devouring the church there. They were even slapping them on the face. This is the signs of manipulative behavior. Now, this slapping was a thing in the Old Testament in ancient times. We see in 1 Kings when Micah is dealing with the prophets of Ahab. Remember, Ahab had 400 prophets, and they were all prophesying that Ahab would be victorious in battle. And Micah came and said, no, Ahab was going to fall in battle. And then Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, went near and struck Micah on the cheek and said, which way went the Spirit of the Lord from me unto you? And so this was a thing. He struck him on the cheek. He struck him out of frustration. And again, in John 18, when Jesus was hauled before the authorities, John 18:21, Jesus replies to one of their questions. Why do you ask me? They were asking about Jesus' teaching. Jesus says, why do you ask me? Ask them who heard me what I have said unto you. Behold, they know what I said. And when Jesus had thus spoken, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, answer you the high priest so? This is abusive behavior. Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if I have spoken well, why strike me? So Jesus replied he gave a very meek reply to these officials when he was on trial before them. And Paul, when the Apostle Paul was on trial in Acts chapter 23, and the high priest commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. So he commanded that Paul would be smitten. And Paul said unto them, God smite you, you whitewashed wall. For do you sit to judge me after the law and command me to be smitten contrary to the law? So the law demanded justice and equity. And this business of going around hitting people was contrary to the law. The law didn't call for this. This was the sin of the sinful nature that was going around striking people and hitting people. And this is what these false apostles, this is the way they were treating the church. They were striking them. And so Paul is pointing out the foolishness of this, the foolishness of letting yourself be controlled by these unsettled people. Paul continues on in verse 21. I am ashamed to admit it, but we have been too weak for that. Paul didn't treat them this way. This is another touch of sarcasm here, where Paul is sarcastic saying, we didn't do that to you. There's no way we would treat you like that. Paul treated them with love and gentleness and kindness. And to repay that, they despised him after they heard the words of these false apostles. They came in and said, oh, Paul was such a weakling. That's how they repaid the kindness of Paul. And so here he is addressing this. Paul says, we were too weak for that. Whatever anyone else dares to claim. Now Paul says, I am talking like a fool here. So this is a parenthetical note. I am talking like a fool. I can claim it too. So these false apostles were going around showing their credentials, parading the things that they had accomplished, parading their pedigree, as it were, in front of these people, saying how impressive they were. Now, Paul is going to show his pedigree as well. He says, this is foolish talk. It's foolish to talk like this. Verse 22. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. So let me just stop here for a minute and take a side note about the difference between Hebrews and Israelites. So Hebrews and Israelites are talking about the same people. Hebrew is the earlier, older word. And this came from scholars are not really sure where the word came from, either because they were across the river or some name or something. They don't know what the origin of this is. The Israelites come from Isaac and Jacob and Esau. So Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was the father of the nation. And Jacob, when he wrestled with God, his name was changed to Israel. And Israel became the father of the nation, and he had 12 sons, and those are the 12 tribes of Israel. And that is where the name Israel comes from, through Jacob, who was also renamed Israel. So Israel's Hebrews are the same people. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Abraham, you remember, did visit Egypt. Abraham and Sarah went into Egypt to escape the famine. And that's where they were called Hebrews. So am I. In Philippians, Paul describes his circumcision, having been circumcised on the 8th day. I am of the nation of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As far as the law is concerned, I was a Pharisee. So Paul was considered a prominent scholar in the Hebrew nation. In Acts 22, Paul says a little bit more, giving his testimony. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but raised in this city, talking about Jerusalem, and educated at the feet of Gamaliel in the strict ways of our ancestral law. I am as zealous for God as all of you are today. So Paul had the pedigree. He had the credentials. Paul had the formal training from when he was a small child, raised up in the way of the ancient ancestral laws. Continuing here in 2 Corinthians, are they ministers of Christ? And again, he can't help but insert these parenthetical notes. I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors, more abundant. In stripes, beyond measure. In prisons, more frequent. In deaths, or in other words, in danger of death, often. So this is the ministry that Paul has. He was traveling through the ancient world, and the ancient world was a hostile place. Traveling, even in spite of the Roman roads, came with many challenges and dangers. And sometimes when he went to these places, they didn't want to hear what he had to say, or they wanted to hear in the beginning, but then they turned against him when they found out what the message was. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes less one. So this is a significant beating. When the Jews would punish someone, the book of Deuteronomy says, 40 stripes he may give and not exceed, lest if he should exceed and beat him more than these with the stripes, then your brother should seem degraded unto you. So 40 stripes was the limit, and the Jews, being punctilious about these type of legalistic rules, were very careful to only give 39 stripes. They wanted to be sure that they didn't exceed the number of stripes, so they gave 39. But Josephus tells that there was another reason for the 39 stripes, and that was because the scourge that they used had 3 thongs, according to Josephus. It said they would take this 3 strong scourge and hit 13 times with it. So 13 times with this 3 scourge is triple strong, ends up as 39 lashes. So this is the Jews. Now think about this. Paul received this stripes from the Jews 5 times he suffered this. Now as you remember back to the book of Acts, when we're going through the book of Acts, when Paul went into the city, where did he go first? The first place he visited was the Jewish synagogue. This is the place he went first. The people beat him 5 times, and he still went back over and over to the Jewish synagogues. That's where he went to preach the gospel. That's where he went to proclaim the message of the Lord Jesus Christ, right into the lion's den, right into those Jewish synagogues where he was putting himself in danger of being beaten to go and present the message to the Jews. Because when these Jews heard this, if they did not receive this message, then they beat him. They hauled him outside and give him a beating. And the book of Acts doesn't record any of these beatings, of these particular beatings. It's surmised that Paul was beaten when he was, just before he confronted Elymas, the prophet. Remember, Paul went there. That was on his first missionary journey with Barnabas. Paul traveled to, I think the city was Paphos, and to the governor there, who's also named Paul. And it was suspected that Paul was beaten there. He was beaten with rods there because there is a pillar. It's called the Paul Pillar that shows where he was beaten. But 5 times Paul received this 40 stripes minus 1. Verse 25. 3 times I was beaten with rods. So this is a Roman punishment. And the Romans didn't care how many stripes they laid on him. They would just beat him until they were tired, until their arm was tired. And this was a very brutal beating, where they stretched a person over one of these pillars and had a stick, a small round stick, kind of a whippy stick, and they would beat with this. They would beat with this stick. And this was being beaten with rods 3 times. This was a Roman punishment. And by the way, it was illegal to beat a Roman citizen. You couldn't do that. This happened to Paul 3 times. Remember in the city of Philippi, he was beaten. They hauled him off and beat him before they threw him in prison. And Paul said that he's a Roman citizen, and when they heard he was a Roman citizen, they were afraid. The city fathers were afraid because they had beaten him, and they just wanted him to leave town quietly and not make a fuss. Anyhow, continuing on. Once I was stoned. Remember the second missionary journey? The first missionary journey as Paul left Lystra. He was dragged outside of the city and stoned, left for dead. Paul got up, went back into the city, and kept preaching. He was stoned there. 3 times I suffered shipwreck. More that's not recorded. We recorded the 4th time he shipwrecked on the island of Malta, but 3 times prior to that, Paul was shipwrecked. Traveling around the ancient Mediterranean was a very hazardous occupation. They didn't have the modern weather forecasts and things, and these contrary winds could strike up in a moment and threaten the ship, and they did. 3 times he was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. This is a night and a day floating in the ocean. Just out there on a piece of driftwood floating around. A very serious suffering. Verse 26. In journeys often. In perils of waters. This is the rivers. As Paul would hike into the mountains, you could have these flash floods, these dangerous floods, or in the springtime when the rivers were swollen, they had to do these river crossings, dangerous river crossings. And even today at the Rio Grande River, there's people who perish just crossing that river. They slip, fall, they don't have a stick in their hand, and they perish in the river. Perils of waters, in peril of robbers. These ancient paths were notorious for the robber gangs that would attack the travelers. They would attack them at a narrow spot or a spot where there was a large high cliff overlooking some ocean someplace. They would attack them right at that narrow spot and then throw the body over the cliff. This is a very dangerous place to travel. In perils by my own countrymen. The Jews didn't like Paul. In perils by the Gentiles. The Romans didn't like Paul for different reasons. The Jews thought he was preaching against the law. The Romans thought it was treasonous to preach one God. In perils in the city. In perils in the wilderness. In perils in the sea. In perils among false brethren. So all these places, wherever Paul turned, there was threats against him. Verse 27, in weariness and painfulness. Paul worked. He had to work and provide for himself and think about the church. In watchings often, in hunger and in thirst, in fasting often. Oftentimes Paul would go without food. There was no food. He had to continue to work without eating. In cold and nakedness. When they threw you in these ancient prisons, they didn't give you any food and they didn't give you any clothes. They put you in there naked. This was part of the punishment, was to humiliate you. And these were not nice prison cells with air conditioning and basketball courts. These were terrible conditions. Dirt floor dungeon filled with human waste. You were in there naked with no food. This is the prison conditions. Besides all these things, verse 28, that are outside, these things that come into him from the outside, that which comes upon me daily. Daily, Paul thought about the church. Every day, the health of the church, the status of the church, how the church was doing was on the mind of the apostle. As he went through all these trials, he wasn't thinking of himself, mainly. He was thinking of the church. He was thinking of that which he loved. He loved the church. He loved the people in the church. And this is what burdened his heart, to think about these people. He wasn't caught up in a pity party. He wasn't a quitter. He wanted to press on and share the gospel with as many people as he could, no matter what it cost him. No matter the inconvenience that it cost him. He wanted to share the gospel of Jesus because Jesus had been so powerful in his own life. Verse 29. Who is weak and I am not weak? Talking about letting the power of God work through him. Who is offended and I burn not? Talking about the evil things that people say against him. Paul is affected by these things, but he doesn't let it distract him from his ministry. If I must boast, I will boast of the things concerning my weakness. That's what Paul wants to boast about. Paul wants to boast about in what he is weak and where Christ is sustaining him. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forevermore, knows that I lie not. Paul is telling the truth. Paul is sharing his heart. He is being very transparent with these foolish Corinthians who were belittling his ministry, who were taking him for granted, who were embracing these foolish leaders. Paul's being honest with them. I'm not lying. I'm telling you things that are the truth. The chapter closes with this vignette. In Damascus, the governor under Archelaus, the king, guarded the city of Damascus with a garrison of soldiers, desirous to apprehend me. We have all these soldiers out there hunting for him. And through a window in a basket, I was let down by the wall and escaped his hands. And this story is told in Acts chapter 9. And Paul is here in Damascus. And Saul, at the time his name was called Saul. Paul didn't change his name. Paul took on the name Saul during his first missionary journey. Prior to that, he was known as Saul at this time. But Saul increased the more in strength and confounded the Jews who dwelt at Damascus, proving that this one, the very Christ. And after many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill Paul. Remember, Paul had come to Damascus with letters of recommendation to round up the Christians and throw them in prison. On the way to Damascus, Paul was struck blind by a vision of Christ, fell off his horse onto the ground, was led by the hand into Damascus, and there God revealed himself to the Apostle Paul. He had a vision or a dream, and God revealed himself to the Apostle Paul and showed him how much he must suffer for the gospel. And after that, Paul's life was changed, and he began preaching Christ, and the Jews took counsel to kill him. Verse 24, but their plot was known of Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and looked him down through a basket in the wall. So Paul escaped the hand of the soldiers. And he adds that to his testimony. And I want to close today reminding us what we saw when we looked at chapter 3. In chapter 3, Paul says this, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who also made us able ministers of the new covenant. This is the new covenant that Paul is preaching. And God made him an able minister of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills. And that's what we see here today. That's what we see in these old false apostles. Killing, death. They're preaching the law of death. But the Spirit, the new covenant, the Spirit gives life. Hallelujah. May God be praised.